Thanks, folks. I'm pleased to kick off our second panel of the day. This one is focused on an issue that we've already heard a little bit about as potentially key to implementation of these laws, and that's energy transmission. Happy to turn the mic over to my good colleague, Professor William Boyd. Thank you, William.
Thanks, Kara. Great to see everyone here. I'm William Boyd. I'm a professor here at the Law School and the Institute of Environment and Sustainability, and a co-director at the Emmett Institute. I teach energy law and regulations, so nothing excites me more than transmission. I can't wait to get into this, and I see a number of students and former students here in the room, so I think we'll really have a great conversation. Here's the plan. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, then I'll provide some brief framing remarks that will connect up with some of what we've already heard today. Then we'll have a round of opening kind of remarks from the panel. We might then have a couple of follow-ups depending on timing. Then we're going to open it up for Q&A, and I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. You are supposed to use the QR code, which is definitely for my generation, this is hard, right? The QR code, to scan that and then submit your questions, and Gabe will be collecting those, so do start thinking about your questions. But if we find that that creates too much distance between the panel and the audience, then we might just go rogue and have an open conversation. And Kara's already upset with me for that, but we may do that. So we'll just see. So do think about your questions here. And then we'll have a brief round at the end of closing comments from our panelists, okay? So introductions. Here in the room with us live is Commissioner Karen Douglas. Karen's a commissioner at the California Public Utilities Commission. She previously served as senior advisor for energy in the office of Governor Newsom, and as a California Energy Commission member from 2008 to 2022. She also directed the California Climate Initiative for the Environmental Defense Fund from 2005 to 2008. Thank you so much for being here, Commissioner Douglas. Next, we have online joining us by Zoom, Jeremy Hargreaves. Jeremy is a principal at Evolved Energy Research, where he focuses on least cost electricity system planning and distributed energy resource evaluation. He has deep, long-standing experience consulting in the energy industry on grid scale and distribution level resource planning. And last but not least, we have, again, also joining us online via Zoom, Jenny Chen. Jenny is the Senior Manager for Clean Energy at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. She previously led federal electricity work at the Nicholas Institute at Duke and worked as an attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and began her early career at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a great place to work for a starting energy lawyer, as I tell all of my students. Okay, a few framing remarks. Infrastructure is back. Industrial policy is back. Government investment is back. Planning is no longer a dirty word. The neoliberal fog is finally lifting. Right? The Biden administration and governments around the world are taking a much more aggressive and interventionist approach to driving capital investment in real, long-lived physical assets as the basis for the clean energy transition. It's actually quite astonishing if you think about it and think about where we were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, right? It is, as David Hayes said this morning, a de-risking approach intended to turbocharge private investment. That does have distributional implications, right? It does have implications for how we think about private and public, for sure, but it's one that is being deployed in creative and interesting ways. So the direct pay provisions and some of the tax credits, the transferability provisions, those are brand new. Will be very interesting to watch those for sure. All of the add-ons that Kim was talking about, right, to get full credit under the tax credit provisions, very interesting to watch how that plays out as well. The amount of capital that is required, right, is substantial, but not insurmountable. We're talking, globally, last year, global investment in the world energy system was about $2 trillion. Half of that, $1 trillion, was clean energy. The other half was fossil hydrocarbons, okay? That is the first time, last year was the first time that global clean energy investment topped $1 trillion and exceeded slightly fossil hydrocarbon investment, okay? So these are going in the right direction. They're not going fast enough, obviously. Most estimates suggest that we need to ramp up that $1 trillion globally to 3 or 4 trillion a year every year, okay? So we do have some multiples here that we're dealing with. That translates into multiple hundreds of billions of dollars a year in the US, okay? We are in a global clean energy transition. When it comes to civilizational scale energy transitions, timing is everything. If you are a lawyer, an energy lawyer right now, you're in a very good position to participate in this transition, right? It is full employment for energy lawyers, regardless of how it plays out. There's an enormous amount of lawyering to be done. Now, I would say, in contrast to the rather pessimistic view that we heard from Jim and Kim, right? Kim, of course, is an economist, and the dismal science is the dismal science. But I actually think if you look at the trends, it's pretty amazing how much of this stuff is actually getting built around the world, including here in the United States. Not getting built fast enough, but the trends are almost exponential for wind and solar, right? So there's an enormous amount of clean energy being built. If you look at the interconnection queues, this is the line to get connected to the grid around the US, right? Massive amounts of clean energy waiting in line to be connected. Not all of those projects will come to fruition, right? Not all of them will be connected, but there's a study that came out yesterday from Lawrence Berkeley Labs that says basically there's more capacity, generation capacity in the interconnection queue right now around the world, around the country, than the entire capacity of the US grid, okay? So there's a bunch of projects here that are lined up and ready to participate. Again, not all of them will come to fruition. 80% of that is solar and storage, okay? That's a huge, huge change from what we saw previously. We are, in some ways, moving, right, from a period where we have been sweating the assets in the power sector, which markets are really good at doing, right? And this is a global phenomena, to a period of investment, okay? So the early 20th century, massive investment in the power sector. From roughly the 90s forward to the last 10 years or so, we saw a period of a lot of asset sweating and improved performance because of the way we designed our electricity markets. Now we seem to be transitioning to another phase of investment. Yes, there are roadblocks, obstacles, et cetera, for sure, right? But they're not really going, in my view, going to stop this in its tracks. Could slow it down, could make it hard to hit the targets that we need to hit, but this is happening, okay? Now, the power sector is the key instrument of decarbonization, okay, for most economies. And it is in the midst of the most significant change it has seen, at least in half a century, okay? New regulatory models, new market arrangements, new technologies, very different cost structures, all of this happening at the same time. The Inflation Reduction Act tries to turbocharge investment in clean energy here in the US through a massive expansion in federal tax credits. The power sector, under any scenario, though, is the backbone of decarbonization for most economies, okay? And the backbone of the backbone, that is the backbone of the power sector, is transmission. And this is where it actually gets hard, right? This is the stress point, as David Hayes says, or the bottleneck, or the big constraint to moving large amounts of utility scale renewables onto the grid, okay? So you could argue that it is the hardest part of the challenge. It's certainly up there if it's not the hardest part, building a lot more transmission. Why is that? It's partly because of the 1935 Federal Power Act, right? And the structure of federalism that is embedded in the Federal Power Act that leaves authority for siting transmission with the states. Now, we can argue about states' rights and all that, but that was a big mistake if you want to build a big national grid, okay? 3 years later in the Natural Gas Act, 1938, we actually federalized siting authority and gave it to the federal government. We didn't do that in 1935, and we've lived with that for a very long time. The 2005 Energy Policy Act tries to fix that with this national interest electric transmission corridor approach that David mentioned. We'll hear more about that today. And with this backstop siting authority for FERC, but that then gets shut down by a couple of federal court decisions. and never really lives up to its potential. Now that has been rejuvenated, brought back to life through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Will it work? How significant will it be? Hard to say. It could have solved that problem of the main power line, perhaps, and things like that. And we can come back to that as well, okay? We have to solve the transmission part of this problem for sure, right? The interconnection queues issue is a piece of that, right? And moving those faster is important, but building more transmission is a big part of this. There's all kinds of things we could get into with grid modernization and the distribution system and all of that. And for sure, we need to be building out a lot more distribution level resources, as Sylvia suggested this morning. But we're still going to need a lot of big renewables as well, it seems to me, especially as we push more and more coal off the system and if we want to start transitioning off of natural gas, right? And so that's what we're here to talk about today, right? I'm going to start with Jenny Chen, then Jeremy, and then Commissioner Douglas. So Jenny, let me start with you. Now, can you give us an overview of the most important kind of features of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act that support expanded transmission, and say a bit about your views of the key challenges facing efforts to implement these provisions and realize the goals of the legislation? Jenny.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. And also thank you for inviting me. I'm super sad that I can't be there in LA. It's much more preferable to be there than here in DC, but it is a long trip, and I'm saving some greenhouse gas emissions by doing this virtually, right? But I'm sorry to not be able to interact with you in person. So do feel free to ask questions at any time, and I'll do my best to respond to those. That was a really great way to kick off the session, and I don't want to go through the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the IIJA, and the IRA in a very dry fashion. So let me just I'll go through some of the basic provisions, but also just like take it back up a notch a little bit, even though you did, Professor Boyd did an amazing job covering the overview. But just to back up a little bit, today's system was largely built by utilities to serve their customers within their own territories. And this piecemeal build out of transmission doesn't incorporate the longer lines needed for renewable power integration and adapting to extreme weather that covers multiple utility footprints. And we know that transmission that's built planned by these utilities, built by these utilities, are typically paid for through utility rates by electricity customers. So there is a mechanism to pay for these lines. And if it's done through a planning process, then the cost allocation is supposed to determine FERC's planning rule and cost allocation rule is supposed to help determine who pays for the lines based off of the benefits they receive. So utilities do have access to capital, but they might not have incentives to deploy the capital on longer lines that enable more resources sharing to be shared between different utilities. So I think just to back up a little bit, we do want to think about the incentives that utilities that might be that might own their own generation or might be affiliated with generation companies. If utilities are getting an ROE, like a return on the amount of capital they expend, they may not be as interested in sharing resources, because sharing resources means that they don't have to build as much. And so there is this disincentive to building out transmission lines between different utility footprints to share resources between utilities, even though they do obtain a return on the capital investments in the investments that they're making on their transmission. There are also a couple of other incentives I just want to highlight now before we really dive into some of the congressional actions, legislation. But some utilities, so they get the same, there are ways to adjust the amount of return on equity that they get. And FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has rules on that, but it's not necessarily, these utilities don't necessarily get a higher ROE for building interregional transmission or interutility, interstate transmission. And it's actually easier for them on a regulatory level to build transmission upgrades or local projects, especially if they're reliability projects within their own footprints. So there is capital that's being deployed for transmission, but it's mostly spent on these local upgrades because the utilities have an incentive to pursue these projects because, one, it doesn't open them up to sharing resources or buying resources from other utilities. And two, these are projects that are easier and lower risk for them to pursue from a regulatory perspective. So I wanted to highlight that because I do want to come back to this point later on. But we know that in terms of getting transmission built, planning for transmission, siting for transmission, and paying for transmission are all very important key points to enabling transmission, particularly interstate, interregional transmission to get built. And if we want to think about this in a more how to do it right, how to do it in a way that is inclusive, transparent, this is an important first step because, you know, I know that Professor Boyd highlighted the main example, or there are other examples out there actually where people who oppose projects oftentimes don't feel heard. So including a lot of these risks or to eliminate, to diminish siting risks and to include more voices at the table means that you want to take into account these types of perspectives early in the process. So actually, a very having a transmission planning process that includes more voices at the table early on and takes into account all of these perspectives can be helpful for both getting the kinds of lines that we want, but also citing them later on. So let me jump into, just on a very high level, what the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act do. Both of these pieces of legislation largely focus on carrots, so funding to help with interregional planning, funding to help with siting challenges that states might face, and direct loans and grants for certain types of transmission lines. But there is one key piece of legislation that is not just about funding. It actually clarifies Section 216 from the Federal Power Act that was first enacted back in 2005. It was the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which gave authority to the federal government backstop siting over interstate transmission lines. And that law was never successfully implemented for a couple of reasons. In one case, there was a court challenge where the law was it was challenged on the basis of, okay, if a state says no, does that mean that the federal government gets backstop siting authority? And the court said no. And this is the case that that the law from the Bipartisan Infrastructure law, the bill, or the IIJA, tries to clarify. So they came back and clarified that that backstop siting authority for interstate transmission is can kick in, and the federal government can preempt states even when a state says no, not just when it withholds or delays the siting approval, but even if it says no, we will not cite this line. So there are a number of criteria that the law provides as well, because we want to make sure that the states have a voice. And there is a way for states to come and forestall the siting, the backstop siting, so they can form an interstate compact and collaborate, have a way to collaborate with their neighbors on siting. The law also requires that that existing rights of ways are taken into account as much as possible. So these could be existing utility rights of ways. So there are utility transmission line rights of ways where they're underutilized. So there's excess capacity. You can build more transmission, or you can read conductor. You can increase the capacity along any given right of way, along certain rights of ways, and that's something that the bill wants to take into account. And just to provide an example on that, the Mid-Continent System Operator, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, recently successfully put through a long-term transmission plan where 85% of the lines in its footprint in MISO North actually takes advantage of existing utility rights of ways. To use this federal backstop siting authority, you also need to minimize siting on sensitive environmental areas and cultural heritage sites, and it has to result in transmission that would reduce customer electricity costs. So DOE is also indicating that it's going to consider these this backstop siting. So sorry, this backstop siting must also occur within DOE's national interest electric transmission corridors. So these are designations that DOE has to make. And as part of that designation process, DOE has to first conduct a need study, which can consider future needs for transmission, and that can include demand as well as the resource mix of the future, and identify where transmission lines are needed. So DOE has released a draft study, and that was back in February of 2023, and it's out for comment. FERC is in the process of a rulemaking process to implement the backstop siting authority, and it's considering questions like, what does it mean for the utility to make a good faith effort to engage with stakeholders and landowners? So FERC also has a piece in shaping the implementation of this law. So I think what's really also key about this this designation of NIETCs is that these corridors is that projects within these corridors are not only eligible for this backstop siting treatment, but there is also funding in the Inflation Reduction Act for projects that are eligible in these corridors. So that is the main piece of legislation that is not a funding or financial assistance piece. I think maybe I've gone on for quite a while, but I just want to say that this is not the only, I think a lot of the action that's going on in the federal government is happening at the administrative level. So do keep an eye on what is going on at FERC, not just DOE and not just what's coming out through Congress, but FERC's doing a tremendous amount of important work. So it's undergone a proposed rule that requires regional transmission planning, or to actually reform its Order 1000 regional transmission planning rule. And it's also looked at a couple of other things, including the potential for a minimum transfer capacity rule. So right now, FERC doesn't require inter-regional planning, just planning on a regional level. So between different regions, like the California Independent System Operator, where you are. So there's a Western Order 1000 region that CAISO is a part of, and say, its neighbors. There isn't a lot of inter-regional planning going on, and the West is different from the East. It's a little bit worse in the East. In the Eastern interconnection, but there are ideas out there for, if we can't get a rule on interregional planning requiring that these different regions actually get together and plan for a line that can traverse them. And and sorry if I didn't mention this or if nobody else mentioned this, but Southwest Power Pool, for example, sees a lot of negative prices due to wind that's bottled up during certain hours. And so if you had more interregional transmission lines, you can get some of those out to MISO, from MISO to PJM, and so on. So that is the reason why these interregional lines are very important. But FERC is looking into this. It was through a virtual tech conference. FERC is also looking into what it should be doing in terms of environmental justice. It had a recent roundtable on that. How to contain costs for customers. So there are a number of very important things going on at FERC that we should certainly pay attention to. So with that, I think we should definitely pass it along because I've probably gone on for too long. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And we'll come back to some of the implementation questions there and what FERC is up to. But thank you so much for those opening comments. So Jeremy, I want to turn to you now, and I'm hoping the Zoom gods will bring you up here full screen, but because I have no capability to do that. There we are. So let's kind of back out a little bit, Jeremy, and look at the big picture here regarding the broader net zero challenge across the Western US. Can you give us a sense of how transmission kind of fits into this broader agenda? And if we fail to get all the transmission we need or think we need, are there alternative paths that we should be exploring, or sort of alternatives that we should be keeping in mind to recognize that there's no one right way necessarily to get to the future we need to get to? So Jeremy.
Great, thanks very much, William. So I'll put some slides up here and hopefully everybody can see those. I want to take this, as William was saying, take it higher level and put this in the context of where we're going in the future. Basically what my company does is works with governments, utilities, other different planning entities on thinking about what sort of investments are necessary to get to future goals, whether those are electricity, clean electricity goals, or net zero emissions goals. And we think about this economy-wide. So the whole energy economy, what are the ways that we transition this going forward in the future, both motivated by things like IRA right now in the short term, and targets that we're setting for ourselves in the long term, whether those are state targets on emissions or maybe in the future, federal targets. So I want to leave you with 4 key points that I think are kind of themes in energy transition related to transmission. The first of those, which Jenny was touching on as well, is siting and permitting will drive the new energy map. So where we are in 20, 30 years will really be shaped by what we were capable of siting and permitting. And in the case of transmission, what we can site and permit basically in the next 10 years, given the timelines involved with building transmission. So just at the simplest level, regional transmission's role, so interstate transmission in the West, is for geographic and resource diversity. We have incredible resources in the West. We have amazing Southwest solar with some of the highest cap factors in the world. We have Northeast wind in Montana and Wyoming that is exceptional and able to provide really low cost energy. But these places oftentimes are pretty far from load. And so how do we deliver those resources to load? They're also very complementary to one another as well. Solar produces in the middle of the day, wind rounds out that supply shape, so it better matches with our load shape over time. And so being able to build a balanced system that has access to both of these really excellent resources is one way to get to cost-effective net zero economies in the future. But the rapid growth of the renewable energy sector is going to face challenges with siting. This is hundreds of gigawatts we're talking about. If you look at the scale on the right-hand side there, this is putting in a lot of infrastructure at really an unprecedented rate. And we can't expect everything to go right as we're doing this. We have potentials for how much can actually go in based on, overlaying different land use types and so on. But already, if you look at resources that have been cited, permitted in places like California, there have been a lot of challenges. And if we think about what's getting built now, that may well be the low-hanging fruit from a siting permitting perspective, and things are going to get harder as we move forward into the future. So we need to think about this in a very coordinated planning sense, not just from a state level, but a regional level, because there are states with exceptional resources and low loads, places like Montana, Wyoming, but weak connection to the rest of the West. And then there are places that have poorer resource quality, but they have large loads. And that would be places like Washington, for example. And so profitable development of renewables and fuels production, it depends on access to markets, and that's through transmission or pipelines, as we'll talk about next. But conversely, the transmission or pipeline development depends on development of the renewables and fuels production. So we have kind of a chicken and egg problem here, where we need the transmission to access markets, but a lot of the time we need to have a transmission line fully subscribed to build that. We need contracted renewables, but we're not going to be able to get financing for the new renewables unless we have certainty around the delivery. And so these sort of interstate challenges are just get a lot harder than what we're doing on the state level, where we have more control over every part of the process. The second point that I want to leave you with here is the competition for transfer of clean energy. It's going to come down to wires versus pipes in the long term. And this is sort of a out there kind of position, because we're thinking about getting all the way to net zero. But we have this incredible set of resources, diverse resources across the West, and clean energy is going to be useful to us as electricity, but also as fuels. We'll still have parts of the economy that we haven't managed to electrify, things like aviation, shipping. And so both of these are going to be useful long-term to decarbonize the economy. And what's the best way to transport clean energy? Is it fuel or is it electricity? And that depends on the relative costs and feasibility of transporting electrons versus gases versus liquids. So we have a whole variety of new opportunities that we don't really see on the system currently. The first is new long distance transmission, and that could include high voltage DC lines, reconductoring or new build with high ampacity conductors. So as Jenny was alluding to, reconductoring is as an opportunity that may have a lower hurdle to overcome. You don't have to be building a new corridor to build the transmission. You could reconductor, and being able to transfer more power with the same corridor is an attractive prospect when we're talking about hundreds of gigawatts of new renewables. And so new types of transmission line, whether that's high temperature conductors that are currently on the market or future superconducting transmission lines, we could utilize our existing corridors more effectively. And then the fuel side of things, hydrogen liquid fuels production, local to high quality resources. So next to the remote wind or next to the remote solar, likewise with direct air capture co-located with the high quality renewables and maybe sequestration sites. These are opportunities for building an industry next to the renewables that actually doesn't need transmission, but it may need new pipelines to transfer clean energy to other places. And so this is kind of the trade-off long-term when we're going to a net zero economy. The third point here is on IRA. This is bringing forward adoption of both nascent technologies and electric load growth. So regardless of whether you have an emissions target, clean electricity target, or you don't have any target, IRA is now driving us economically towards clean energy that we currently didn't have that direction before. So technologies that were previously forecasted for 2040s, or at least became economic in forecasting studies, those are now shifted forward. So early 2030s, we'll see electrolysis, direct air capture. Our national studies are showing that the ITC and PTC incentives on renewables really align very well with the pathway that we would want to take to net zero anyway. So even though we don't have a net zero target, IRA is driving us on a trajectory over the next decade that's taking us basically on that same trajectory to net zero. Electrolysis to produce hydrogen is cost effective with IRA incentives. So I think that the limitation there is not so much the economics, but the feasibility of building out new hydrogen markets and electrolyzer infrastructure, as well as the pipelines to transport. And then IRA accelerates electrification, primarily through the vehicle incentives. There's some small amounts of money available for electrification in other places, but that's going to drive more electricity load. So transmission, this means that we need to site a lot of transmission faster than we were thinking about doing before. And that's not just traditionally, reactive, we're building a new wind or solar plant in state, but thinking about what are, as William was describing, these backbone transmission investments that are necessary to meet our needs in the future. And then the fourth point here is transmission is long lead time, long lifetime. So planning should start now. Transmission assets built in the next decade will spend much of their lives in a net zero economy, or at least a low emissions economy. These lines last for 50, 60 years, and we can bring a large line on this, like this, online maybe 10 years from now. And so in large part, they're going to be online and active in a system that looks very different from the system today. And because we know where we're going now, in large part, we know in the West that we're going to be going towards net zero targets. At least all the major load centers have those on the books now. We can think proactively rather than reactively. We know what we need 20, 30 years in the future, so build a transmission infrastructure that serves that need. And that includes planning for integrated energy systems across geographies, across states, and planning for sector coupling between electricity and fuels. And then second point here is transmission takes time to build, so planning needs to start now. We've had very few transmission lines built in the West in the last 10 years, and all of them have had long lead times, cost overruns, and been seeing some major delays. And so making sure that we know where we're going and we know what we need to get built right now is important for something that's coming on early 2030s. I have a final word on uncertainty here, but you can stop me if I've run over time. The major takeaway, I think, on uncertainty is that siting and permitting challenges for renewables and by extension, transmission expansion, they're one of the largest uncertainties that we face in getting clean energy adoption and going to net zero future. And to sort of go back to the first point, this is in large part going to shape where we are in 20, 30 years from now. The first uncertainty is on costs for transmission. As I said, we've had little recent large scale development or interstate development to benchmark costs against, and those costs have overrun. But when we do studies on this and look at the economics of it, actually building a lot of this transmission is relatively insensitive to cost. So even if you have much higher costs than you estimated, that access to diverse and high quality resources is so valuable that you still build transmission. And so the major uncertainty that's going to drive this is feasibility. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, both the physical, what land are you crossing, et cetera, and also regulatory, as Jenny was describing. But I think it's important to think about this as a game of whack-a-mole, not think about transmission in isolation. If we try and cite transmission and we can't do it, then we've just caused a stress point or a pain point to pop up somewhere else. Because if we don't get that transmission, we need to rely on more local resources that may be lower quality, hard to site, hard to permit, face challenges for local transmission interties. And so it is a game of where are the hardest challenges, and what can we do about those, and what can we do to overcome them. So I'll leave you on this final point, that pursuing transmission despite the uncertainty is valuable both economically, because it can lead us to lower cost economy-wide solutions in the future. And it also provides us optionality when achieving net zero goals. If we've pursued transmission, then we've pursued more pathways to reach net zero, and we can fail at more things before we don't reach our targets in the future. And so it's a really important component of achieving the West's goals for clean energy, clean electricity, and net zero emissions.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was great. Now I'm going to turn to Commissioner Douglas. And let's take a look at this from the perspective of California, and specifically from the perspective of the California Public Utilities Commission. Obviously, we need to significantly ramp up our investment in transmission in California and beyond to hit our clean energy targets. The California Independent System Operator has just issued a draft transmission plan identifying something like 46 transmission projects that it estimates will cost, or collectively cost, around $9.3 billion. That's a lot of new investment. And the Public Utilities Commission will be front and center in overseeing the process for approving and citing many of these new transmission lines. My simple question to you, Commissioner Douglas, is can we do it? And what, in your view, are the biggest obstacles standing in the way of realizing this increased investment?
All right, well, thank you. It's great to be here today, and I want to congratulate the audience for having made it through 45 minutes of transmission, because transmission is no fun at all, ever, it seems like. I want to take a step back and inject, and you started it with your question, inject a sense of urgency and right here, right now into our transmission discussions. So we're sitting here at UCLA, so we're in Los Angeles, and those of us in energy land consider this to be a load center. Why? This is a place where a lot of people live, a lot of people drive cars, we have lights, we have computers, we have a booming economy, we make things, we do things. We import, we've got busy ports, some of the busiest ports in the country. We transport goods. Some of the goods coming in through the ports of LA and Long Beach go around the country. And Los Angeles and Southern California are moving quickly to implement climate plans. And what do those plans look like? You're here, those plans include shifting to a cleaner electricity mix. So that's more solar, more energy efficiency, battery storage for times when the renewables aren't producing. It means that utilities and the state and the federal government, through some of these incentive programs, are providing incentives for people to electrify their vehicle fleets, electrify their heating in their homes, electrify cooking, with induction stovetops. So we are on the cusp of a very massive shift towards electricity as a much more prime how we power our lives, in part because we can make electricity zero carbon, and in part because some of these electric technologies are actually just plain better, particularly from an air pollution standpoint, as well as a climate change standpoint. So we are in this transition, and this electrification is happening. It is happening now. It is pushing demand for electricity up well beyond where it would be if we just looked at economic and demographic trends without electrification. And it means that demand for electricity is going up. And that's a good thing. That's what we want. But we need the clean electricity to go into the grid. And when you're sitting here in LA, the greening of LA, the shift of power sources in Los Angeles increasingly to electricity has very significant implications for the Central Valley, the Central Coast, Imperial Valley, Nevada, Arizona, Wyoming. Why? Because we need to import power from a diverse set of resources to California, to our load centers, in order to meet this growing demand. And so that's the transmission question. Now, what happens if we don't get the transmission done? What happens is delays in greening our generation fleet. So we do have gas generation in California. We're still pretty heavily reliant. We have plans and aspirations to shift from natural gas generation to cleaner sources. That can only be achieved if we get the projects online that we need to provide reliable power. There's actually two reasons why, from an LA perspective, there should be interest and support for some of this transmission that we're looking at doing. One is what I've talked about, bringing in clean energy. The other is providing the additional reliability and capacity to import into this load center so that some of the existing fossil generation in the LA basin can be retired while maintaining reliability. So, and when you look at the independent system operators 2022-23 transmission plan, they talk about that, and they talk about, some of the transmission that they look at. A lot of it is about bringing clean generation into the system in various ways, but some of it that they're looking at is specifically around providing the ability to be able to reduce the fossil generation. That doesn't mean to zero, but to have the capacity to reduce fossil generation and replace that with clean energy. So that's why we're doing it, and that's why we're doing it now. And it's really remarkable when you look at how fast the California system is changing. When we passed AB 32, it's like a distant memory now. We're gonna reach 1990 levels of emissions by 2020, right? We complied 4 years early. Great. A lot of that was carried by the electricity sector. A lot of that was stepping back off of coal and building clean energy pushed by the renewables portfolio standard. So that was great. And we're working towards the SB 32 goals, and we're making progress, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Fantastic. We're making our way there. We're not there yet. We're implementing SB 100, and that's where things start to get interesting, because SB 100, so 90% clean by 2035 retail sales. Okay, fine. 95 by 2040. Sounds like just a little bit more. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. The closer you get to 100, the harder it is. The closer you get to 100, the more you have to do. Okay, 100% by 2045. So those are the goals that we're analyzing. Those are the goals that we're trying to meet, and that we're planning towards, and that we're procuring towards, while maintaining affordability and reliability. That's what we need to do here in California in this energy transition. And we also need to do that understanding that other sectors are going to meet their greenhouse gas targets by fuel switching to electricity. Not 100% of them, not immediately, fortunately for us, but quickly. And we want to plan for that, and we need to plan for that, and it's already happening, and it's a good thing, and we can do it, but we have to have it baked into our planning. So that's why that's why we are seeing a record-breaking expansion of clean generation capacity. It's not just that when we did the SB 100 study, we concluded that we needed a record-breaking expansion of clean generation capacity. We did. It's because we are seeing it. And so when you, what's really kind of interesting for me, so the independent system operator, when they plan transmission, they plan it based on input they get from the Public Utilities Commission on what to expect in the next 10 years. And that's, you know, informed by the Energy Commission as well. And what's really astonishing is the pace of change of what they're planning for. So it's supposed to be kind of an incremental planning process, right? So every year, the ISO does this report and analyzes transmission. And in normal times, you know, some years you might need more, some years you might need less. It's incremental, right? And what we're seeing over the course of the last few years looks kind of like this. 2020, the 2020-21 plan. Yeah, you might need 1,000 megawatts more per year. Okay. The next year they do the plan, the 2021-22 plan. You might need 2,700 megawatts per year over the next 10 years, right? Well, the next year we do the plan. Yeah, more like over 4,000 megawatts per year. That's this one. We already know that because it was the sensitivity study analyzed by the ISO, that the next plan, the 23-24 plan, is going to be over about 7,000 megawatts per year growth. And we're expecting this kind of sustained growth over time, and we need to find a way to sustain it. I liked Elliot Mainzer's quote in the LA Times, well, failure is just not an option. You know, we're finding ways to get this done because we need to get this done. So, so let's talk about some of what we're doing here. And this is where, when I was at the Energy Commission, I got to do a lot of permitting. I was on permitting from my first day at the Energy Commission. So I got to see it when you guys remember 2008, the Great Recession and the Recovery Act and stimulus. And so we mounted a major permitting effort to get projects over the line. That was successful. At the beginning of that, people said, you know, oh, it'll never get done. California will never figure it out. It's all going to be built out of state. That didn't happen. We need partnerships out of state. You know, we're totally into these kinds of partnerships, but we can get our side of this done. It does require an element of recognizing that we are all in this together. In my permitting days, you know, and I heard a former speaker in the last panel kind of talk about this a bit, you know, is there an element of, oh yeah, we love clean energy, but not this, not here? Of course there is. And you know, and I've seen it. I've done public meetings in the desert and people are like, well, we're all for it, but it should be offshore wind. And you go to the coast and it's like, oh, well, shouldn't it be in the desert? And, you know, everyone agrees it can be on rooftops, but it just can't all be on rooftops, but we'll do as many as we can. So with storage, so that it works in the system. So, you know, I think a lot of when we have been at our best in this, it has been by really kind of understanding that we have to solve this together. We have to solve this in a cross-sector way. We have to understand the intersections between the speed at which we move, the measures we need to take to support reliability, the measures we need to take to support affordability as we do this, the fact that we are making this transition during a time of real climate change and upheaval, when we are being challenged every year by newer and more difficult and unpredictable events in the climate. So it's a very fast-moving policy space on transmission. We just have to find a way. And part of what I have heard and had so many public discussions about, and I just wanted to kind of end on this note here. You know, everyone, every region has a role to play in this transition, and some of the things that we are going to have to do are going to be hard, whether it's, you know, whether it's looked at from an urban perspective or from the perspective of some of the areas where the projects are built, whether it's looked at from how do we partner, how do we get the transmission done, how do we think differently about permitting so that we really can give communities a voice but meet timeline and get that done. And on that note, we did pass last year AB 205, which is a different way of trying to balance the permitting and the community engagement and kind of the speed, but also thoroughness. And so we can talk about that if anyone wants to. But in any case, I think I'll wrap there. Transmission is hard. We have to get it done, and we will.
Love it. Thank you, Commissioner Douglas. So we are 15 minutes from closing. Gabe, you've been collecting questions. Before we go to the questions, I just want to briefly offer any of the three panelists to weigh in on anything they heard from the other panelists. So if we could bring Jenny and Jeremy back on the screen, just wanted to give you guys, Commissioner Douglas, Jeremy, Jenny, an opportunity to say anything based on what you heard from the others, and then we'll go to questions from Gabe. Is Jenny out there too? There we are. Great. Any reactions, any comments, anything you want to add before we go to questions? Doesn't look like it. Okay. All right. Gabe, you have some questions for us.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much to our excellent moderator and panelists for joining us today to share their insights on the new transmission build-out. Let's start with a question that maybe we can direct initially to Commissioner Douglas and then open up to the other panelists. With wildfire risk being a concern in the West, particularly in California, how does that affect the siting of new transmission? What sort of measures are decision makers looking at to manage wildfire risk?
An easy one.
It's a big question, but of course we've got mapping of wildfire risk. There are, you know, every year improvements to management around reducing the risk on existing lines. Obviously, when you're siting a new one, you do have opportunity to take that into account when you look at a line. Wildfire risk is a vulnerability without a doubt. And it is one among many, you know, drought is another and flood is another. And so we definitely live in a world where we have to incorporate higher levels of multiple and interacting or intersecting risk. What that can argue for, although it depends on the case, it can argue for figuring out a higher level of redundancy. And you always have to ask the question, you know, what happens if something is affecting this transmission line? What happens if something is affecting this transmission line and it's a dry year and it's especially hot? And so you do have to go through that kind of thinking.
Jenny, Jeremy, you want to add anything on that?
Sure. Yeah. So the mapping tool idea that Commissioner Douglas brought up is a really great one. And
we're having a hard time with the
volume. Oh, you
volume.
can't hear me. I'm sorry. Okay. Is that better? Or? Okay.
Yeah,
good.
That's better.
Okay. Yeah. I was just saying the mapping tool idea that Commissioner Douglas brought up is a really good one. There's certainly, there's the Argonne National Labs energy zones mapping tool. And certainly the mapping tools that we have could be improved upon in terms of additional data and layers. So, you know, they can include things like, in addition to environmentally sensitive areas, cultural heritage sites, existing rights of ways, whether they're highways, railways, or existing transmission rights of ways, or risks, areas that are at risk of wildfires, other natural disasters. these are all things that we can and should be mapping and identifying early in the planning process. We could also include things like environmental justice areas, communities, disproportionately burdened communities, and maybe communities that are interested in more economic development. So I think considering these siting risks early on is a really important one, and we should definitely leverage that the tools to bring that into the process as early as possible.
Yeah, I would second what Jenny says about the mapping tools, to extend that a little bit, that we need data that is representative of the risks that are out there, and a lot more can get done to develop a better understanding of transmission opportunities. We use a data set that's been developed by TNC during their Power Place West study that factors in wildfire risk and the costs associated with the upgrades necessary to mitigate that. But there are other opportunities, I think, in the future where, Commissioner Douglas was talking about backup and resiliency on the system. I think kind of going in the opposite direction of that, there may be opportunities for protected corridors where we can reconductor with higher ampacity lines and limit the number of new corridors we need to build through areas of high risk. And so that's, I guess, another way of adding resiliency to the system.
Yeah, you got another one for us?
Yes, we do. We have a lot, actually.
Okay.
We've received several questions about distributed energy resources and how that may help to ameliorate some of the need for the build out of transmission. I know, Jeremy, you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but can you walk us through some of the challenges related to community resilience programs and the need to build out more transmission and how they interact?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's very dependent on the area. So if you're thinking about the Northwest, for example, then you probably don't get as much value from distributed solar anyway, just because of coastal weather conditions. And so cap factors on coastal solar in the Northwest are really low compared to grid scale that you could build in Eastern Washington or something like that. In California, it's a much more sort of one-to-one relationship in terms of weather, because it's sunny everywhere other than maybe San Diego with weather effects coming in. And so it kind of depends on where you are as to what sort of contribution they can make to the system. If it is California and you're in a sunny place, then you can displace a lot of the grid scale solar that you would otherwise have built. But in terms of local resilience, I think that it really needs to be paired with some kind of dispatchable capability. So local storage put in, or demand response programs. Just solar by itself, because of the sort of geographic concentration, particularly when you're on lower parts of the distribution system, you're not going to get a reliable contribution. A cloud might come over and it cuts that whole part of the system out, so you can't depend on it. But as you get more and more aggregated, the larger and larger the part of the distribution system you're counting on is, maybe at sub-transmission level, then it can have more and more of a contribution towards reliability. Yeah, but I think a portfolio effect between solar storage and distributed programs, DERs, or demand response is the way to go.
So if I could just briefly step in. So Jeremy is, of course, correct that California's got fantastic solar resources. It was cloudy when I walked into the law school today. If we were running LA on the solar produced from LA today, we would not be running very well. It's very sunny in Sacramento, where I came here from. And so that is part of what Jeremy was talking about the portfolio effect. The more intermittent the resources are that you run from, the more helpful it is to be able to take advantage of the diversity in resource types, because you said, let's say offshore wind will give you great resources in the morning and in the evening hours when you're not getting very much solar, especially the early, particularly evening is really when you want it. So I do see really exciting potential for enhancing resilience from distributed generation of various types with storage, and the PUC is exploring that through various proceedings. But for example, in the microgrid context, looking at areas that are particularly subject to disruptions, to power, public safety power shutoffs, and so on, and just increasing the ability to ride through some of these disruptions with public service and electricity service intact. That's a very important thing to do as we move forward.
If I may,
Jenny,
also
you want to say anything on this?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics because the demand side is often a resource that is overlooked, but it's a resource that jumps in when we really need it. So, back in 2020, when California had a heat wave, it was 4,000 megawatts of customer curtailments when Governor Newsom came on and said, hey, we've got an emergency. We really need everybody to ramp down your usage. And that put an end to the several day long rolling blackouts that you had. And so we have more demand side resources than we know of. And we need a better system of bringing those to come online when we really need it. So prices, Jeremy talks about dispatchability. Prices could certainly help if we can expose some of these customers to the prices. So I worked with the Energy Systems Integration Group, and we just came out with a paper. It's called something along the lines of leveraging locational flexibility. And the idea is that we have all of these electric vehicles coming online. We're going to get more and more of them as transportation electrifies. Some of these vehicles are large, like Tesla semi-trucks. These are going to require megawatt level chargers. The charging plazas will consume a lot of energy, actually. And so one question is, how can we utilize these batteries on wheels? Essentially, they provide a similar service. They could provide a similar service if exposed to prices that reflect the value of electricity by location and by time. So they can charge in places, especially if they're traveling long distances cross country, they can charge where there's a lot of negative priced wind, for example. If we really need them to, they can discharge in places where we don't, where electricity is scarce. So in ERCOT, for example, when Winter Storm Uri was going on, some folks actually relied on their batteries and their EVs to charge their cell phones to get warm. And so we've seen these resources help when we really needed them to. So I think exposing some of these resources to prices and ensuring that we are able to access more customers and influence more customer behavior is really important. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm getting like a red, black, and yellow sign here that says sum up, 2 minutes and 17 seconds left. So I don't think we can take the last question or another question, but I know there are some more really good questions. So I would encourage you to contact the panelists, come up here afterwards. Maybe Commissioner Douglas will be around for a few minutes afterwards to take a couple of questions. I do want to give our panelists a chance to have one last kind of summation here. And I'll just say one thing for each one of them. So from Jenny, what I heard, the big takeaway was that we need to be thinking hard about how we align business models and regulatory models so that we drive investment in the big bulk projects that we need, not so much in the upgrades that seems to be the way that a lot of utilities have been approaching this. From Jeremy, I heard that siting and permitting today is incredibly important for the system that we're going to have tomorrow. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty at both the project level in terms of feasibility, but also at the system level. And we should think about optionality and managing that uncertainty at the system level, in addition to only thinking about it at the project level. And his sort of concept of optionality seems really important and connects a lot with what I think Commissioner Douglas was saying about redundancy and the portfolio approach here. What I heard from Commissioner Douglas, among many things, was that as we electrify more and more of everyday life, the trade-offs, the balance between affordability, reliability, and clean energy become incredibly important. And the PUC and other regulators and stakeholders need to be thinking hard about different pathways to get the right mix, because there's going to be a lot of projects that don't come together. And so the planning around that, right, is going to be incredibly important. It's already happening. We are making a lot of progress. California will do its part. And I think looking for partnerships with other states in the West is a pretty exciting way to think about this. So wrapping up here, last question, right? What is the most important thing we should be doing to achieve our ambitious climate and clean energy targets? And I'll go Jeremy, Jenny, Commissioner Douglas. Jeremy.
I think right now it's making sure that our planning and permitting processes are capable of handling the number of gigawatts of all types of resources, transmission, renewables, new hydrogen facilities, all of those things that maybe we're not geared up to handle at the moment, but we need to quickly get there to be able to make the number of investments we have planned over the next 5-10 years.
Jenny.
If we think about the grid as the world's largest machine, we don't have efficiency standards for the grid as a whole. There are ways to identify places where we can save more electricity that's being lost. Like, for example, wires, if we're losing 5% of the energy that we're creating through line losses, there are ways to help curtail that. So I think thinking on this big picture on a system-wide level, like Jeremy was suggesting, but thinking about how we can encourage utilities to change their incentives or change the incentives that we present to utilities so that they can look for ways to make their operations more efficient, not just by themselves, but together. I think that could help us a lot, and we haven't done a lot of that.
Commissioner Douglas.
So it's a good question. We have to succeed with the build out. That's critical, but there's so much more than that. And people have brought up different solutions, even in the short Q&A we had today. And I would just say, we need engagement, we need mobilization. If you're sitting here and you're thinking they should have talked more about vehicle to grid and you got to fix that, or well, really it's pricing, or, there's this long duration storage technology and people need to pay attention. It's all of it. It's all of it. The space in energy right now and in the energy transition, it's so dynamic, it's so important. So whatever, it's equity, it's affordability, it's getting things clean, it's getting the build out done, it's doing permitting fast, but also doing it well and with buy-in from local communities. So I'll just say, I'm at a law school, we got some students here, we got professionals here. Get engaged, stay engaged. We need you. Important work to do.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.